This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And we'll handle a few local things, and then I'd like to talk about Yellowstone, because this month's National Geographic has an excellent article. It's an excellent set of articles about Yellowstone. Invariably, any good ecological situation has a large area. We're very unfortunate in that our only remnant prairies are along railroad lines and in occasional cemeteries that haven't been looked after. And that means that it's disjunct territory, and it's not large enough to sample the various sub-ecosystems, and it doesn't allow for migration, and so we're in bad shape. The national people have tried to rectify that by putting in a rather large prairie area on the Flint Hills in Kansas at Manhattan, and so the attempts there are to have a large range, but Yellowstone is the largest, the most visited, the most unique, and also the first national park. And it is attracting tourists that you can't believe. So we'll get into that a little later. Bernadine Stake has a birthday today, and she has been a powerhouse in planning with the Urbana city. She's been on all sorts of committees, and she's an activist. And happy birthday, Bernadine. The Pocket Prairie got some good shout-outs from Don Davis and Denise Courier the other day. They were discussing the work we do there. And that's interesting. We keep having people going through there, and we also have visitors that are just use it as a resource, a retreat. But it's valuable. How we keep it going, we're not so sure, because you need someone to look after it and to monitor it, and that almost won't always be there. The prairie is blooming. I took Eva Jehill out to Camp Creek because she is a regular picker of seed later in the year, and I thought she ought to see the early spring herbs. And yes, we actually put some of them up on our last program, and she's taken photographs and put them up on Facebook, and that got a small avalanche of responses from people and likes. So we're getting better at using some of that media contact with people so that they actually see some of the things we're doing and talking about. The plants that were out there in bloom. Golden Alexander is not a rare plant, but it's one of the early spring flowers, and it's ubiquitous. But the hoary cocoon is a very orange plant. It likes its habitat. It's very hard to get it to transplant. It comes with its friends and relatives, and we don't always know what they are, who they are, whether they're pollinators or whatever. But Golden Alexander is a good, hoary cocoon is a good indication that you've got good prairie. Going along with that is little iris-like plant called starry-eyed grass, which is in profusion, and it's so small, but probably 9 inches tall, just a little star the size of your little finger, and you get to see it most when it's by the thousand. We don't exactly have by the thousand, but we have quite a bit of it. And that's at Camp Creek. Part of the reason for the little prairie across the road is to not have to go to places like Camp Creek to show people some of the uniqueness of a prairie. But the little pocket prairie we have is on poor soil and not awfully good range of prairie habitat. It's enough to give a starter. I was interested this week. I went around to the plot in front of the prairie, and there was a sampling device, a instrument that samples down into the hollow of that parking lot, and I think they were checking up on a Texas gas station that was there a long time ago, but when gas stations pull out, they often put sand in their tanks and just leave them there. So they knew where the tanks were, and they were looking for any leaching that occurs. But it was kind of interesting. This was like the size of a bulldozer with cleat tracks on it, but no seat for a driver. The driver walked beside it with a radio contact and drove the piece of equipment into different places and operated it all from radio contact. When they're finished, they loaded it onto a semi-trailer, once again without any driver. And that kind of impressed me. But it says something about that little area which is right next to the pocket prairie. I did go to South 45, and I was a little concerned about a sunshine rose we have there. It's on the rare side. It's not a running rose, which is a typical rose for prairies. It's an erect rose, and we had brought it into that site before there was a billboard almost on top of it. And the talent is to make sure that it gets to flower and express itself without being mowed off. You have to understand and sympathize with the billboard people that the billboard will sell for more if it is mown and tidy and looks clean. But in this case, I went around and took out loppers and removed honeysuckle and other plants that might lead to mowing, and wrote a little note to Adams, which has been kind enough to make sure we're still there, and we also work with them on the pocket prairie because it's got plants like dock that get to high rise in October, and a very thin thread of flowering stalk that can invade the visual corridor for that sign. So I wanted to beg that it was so non-invasive that we could not have that plant decapitated. So I haven't heard back from them, but they've been quite sympathetic with what we do. Lake Park Prairie, about a month after firing, is absolutely booming with plants. The energy that is in those perennial roots is there, and very shortly you won't even know that it was burned, but the burning helped. Two journalists have been to do profile work. It's part of their career. And as we try to meet a balance between who does what and what we do. And that was quite positive, and those two journalists sent in copies of their reports to their various instructors. And so those two were Emily Scott from down near St. Louis, and Jessica Peterson. Jessica is in regular journalism. Emily is in agricultural journalism. Karen Spearing sent in a copy of a map that she's done on associated with questions on Pope Prairie and Rantoul. We constantly, probably every 2 weeks, I take a bundle of books that come from the comic store, and they're very strong little boxes, and we've for years tried to encourage them to be backloaded so that they could be reused, and that never has happened. So they go into the bin for cardboard recycling, but I pull them out and take them to Books for Prisoners, and I was interested to see that the sale on last Saturday was doing well, and people were taking home a little box with handles and books, and so they have been asking for slightly larger boxes so that they can send things like artwork to the prisoners, and we've been sorting that out. The comic store also has larger boxes, so we send out something like a ton of cardboard each week, and but this is pilfering it and taking it for functional reuse. The Forest Preserve has sent a notice to say that the corridor from Urbana to Danville will be closed, so it's where it's used in places it's closed. I'm hoping still that places like Oakwood will have a fairly narrow trail, because the prairie is right up onto the railroad bed, and the edict at the moment is that you have a 10-foot wide trail with 2 feet on either side of gravel, which really is fairly invasive. But I was interested that that notice came with a logo that included a person as well as a bicycle. So we're working on the logo, because when Heartland Pathways took out this interim trail use agreement with the Federal Surface Transportation Board and the Rail Banking Act, our aim was mainly for remnant prairies preservation. And we were sympathetic with the railroad preservation and sympathetic with the use of trail as an interim in case and preservation, so that the railroad could come back in the future if necessary. But our main aim was to preserve a little of the remnant prairie that we have left. It's not the world's greatest, but that's all we have. But I was interested to see that the logo could be changed to include a person, or a facsimile of a person, and then I'm wanting a little bit of prairie in there that will say something about habitat. And so I'm aware that it's a prize-winning logo, but I would hope it can be modified. Looking at my notes here, try to be ahead of things.
This might be a really good time to jump in and mention something that I forgot to mention at the top of the show. Today is May the 1st, May Day, and this is the Prairie Monk, an hour of discussion of things having to do with the environment and anything else having to do with this community. This coming week is Ride Your Bike Week, basically. I believe on the 3rd, that would be on Tuesday, is Ride Your Bike to School Day, and very soon after that, like maybe Wednesday, is Ride Your Bike to Work. If you go online and check for Champaign and Ride to Work and things like that, you'll find out lots of details, and you can even sign up. You can register, you can get a t-shirt, but I think that you have to make a donation to get the t-shirt and everything like that. So yeah, ride your bike this week. I rode my bike to get here today, a little on the cool side, but a very pleasant ride. The exercise will warm you right up. And back to you.
Yes, you have to think about how you allow bicycles to compete with cars, and we're thinking if you have a trail from Urbana to Danville, how do you go from Urbana to Champaign, and then from Champaign to Decatur? And there's no easy answers, but we want you to think about it. Just how do you travel along University Avenue or wherever you want to ride with your bicycle?
As an avid bicyclist, I can tell you, finding an east-west route is not actually that hard. I live out at Mattis, and I take what's either called Clark or White, depending on how far out you are, and it's a beautiful ride all the way downtown. The only problems are when you have to cross the busier streets. When you get to Prospect, now you have to watch yourself, and likewise when you get over here to Walnut and Neal, it's not as much fun. But once you get across there, as you keep going toward Urbana, it's a very nice, quiet ride. It takes you right through campus on the north edge of campus, a little bit south of Beckman and on the engineering campus.
On Springfield?
Just let me think here. Just north of Springfield. You're a couple of blocks north of Springfield. I should know what that street is. I believe it's the street that takes you right past where WILL has all of their buildings and their little plaza and Friends Plaza and things like that.
You've got to jog a little bit there.
It's not a perfect ride, but it is. The street that you're on is quiet. You're not fighting traffic at all on that entire cross, getting you all the way to downtown Urbana. You're just it ends up being Main Street by the time you get to downtown Urbana, now that I think about it, because it kind of merges with other things. So but it's safer than you might think on the east-west, as long as you're comfortable crossing those busy streets. And as you get to Urbana, you've got things like Lincoln and
I think you can go through the campuses there with Beckman. You can probably ride through the university grounds.
Yes, I suppose you're right. It's easier as you get to campus because you've got some large expanses. As much as they've built the place up, there are some really nice green areas as you go right past my old haunt, the computer science building, and the rest of the engineering campus north of Green there. So yes, plenty of reasons to get out and bicycle, even just to get someplace, because there are some very nice, quiet. If you there are several places in town that you can pick up a map that shows you what the good streets are and which ones you should stay away from. Like, you don't want to ride on Prospect, you should stay away from Mattis and things like that. But if you really want to avoid Prospect Avenue and things like that, there is bound to be a park that you can bicycle to, and they all have sidewalks. I've never had it's never been contested. There are very few people walking on the sidewalks at parks, so you could simply bicycle along on the sidewalks at area parks.
It's controversial because there's a book rule that you get fined $15 for riding on the sidewalk, but it's not very well policed.
I wonder if that applies at parks. It certainly would be. It makes sense. There are signs even posted here in downtown Champaign and in downtown Urbana that, yes, as you say, you can be fined. And there, you've got people who have to worry about bicycling on Main Street in downtown Urbana. They want to stay away from the cars. But I would think in parks it's okay. I will actually look into that.
How do you handle door? When cars are parked and they open the door, sometimes you can open them into a bicycle that's going 15 miles an hour.
Yes, and then people die from that, yes.
Yes.
Streets of San Francisco are very dangerous because if you're coming down a hill, you're going quite a bit more than 15 miles an hour. The best thing to do is stay as absolutely far away. Honestly, slow down and look really, it's hard. If you're in a car don't wave at the bicyclists like to tell us, go on, you can cross the intersection. Because of the way the windows are angled, I can almost never see the person inside the car. Even if we're making eye contact, only they know it. So this isn't a simple thing to do, but you just have to do your best to see, is there a human being in that car, and be ready as you look ahead, car by car by car. Is the door moving in the slightest? Does it look like that door is about to open? I've never been doored, I guess you'd call it. But yeah, it is certainly a problem. I'm sure it happens in this town. When you're the bicyclist, you're the little guy. You have to be extra careful because, like you say, the place has been set up for the people in the cars. So Prospect isn't designed for me. So I have to take the extra responsibility to look twice each direction, look left and look right. And as you start going out, double check, because you may have missed something. There may have been something that was in your blind spot. And so, yeah, I mean, I just have to look really, really carefully at those cars parked along even Clark Street as I'm coming to town here to help here at Weft.
Okay.
But get out there on bicycle anyway. It's safer than you think.
So, continuing with the nature side of things, the Nature Preserve Commission meets tomorrow, on Tuesday, 10 o'clock at Waterloo, which is way down there by St. Louis. They're a body that's part appointed by the governor, part elected, and there's an overseeing body that is the board, and then they have about 30 employees in various parts of the state, and they bring to the board a case for preserving natural areas, or the maintenance of natural areas, or the invasion of natural areas. That is their concern. We have about 3 meetings a year, I think. I was tempted to go to them with the question of the wind prairie, which we were talking about last week. The wind prairie goes from Paris to Decatur through Arcola. It was bought mainly with the intent of a trail, but it also preserves a lot of prairie, and it's been decided that that land should be returned to the farmers, mainly for corn and soybeans, and I worry that that's a huge amount of our only remaining prairie left, and that's the sort of topic where a citizen can come to the meeting and speak on behalf of a natural area, which then may become a target for further research. It's very difficult because the Nature Preserves Commission is a subsidiary of the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and Natural Resources doesn't get a lot of money, and it gets money from licenses and things like that, but not a lot of state money goes to the Department of Natural Resources, so it's very limited in what it can do. Ron Sleater will be coming Tuesday morning, so I can't be at the Nature Preserves Commission meeting, but we're watching the rain. We're into herbiciding the teasel, which is a very invasive species. We've been working at it for years and years. We use herbicide because we can't do anything else. It grows. If you cut it off, it regrows. It's coming from a cemetery nearby where teasel is a prized wreath participant. It has an interesting pod which is used to be used to tease wool. So it's kind of an interesting ornamental, but it escapes the prairie, the cemetery to the prairie, and can be very dangerous in terms of taking over the prairie. You wonder why we use herbicide, but we spot herbicide and we cut the top off and often get the herbicide right on the stem. The plant is a survivor. It likes soft soil, so if you have disturbed soil, it does well. It has a leaf cup which catches water, and it preserves itself in that manner. It takes 2 years to grow, So what Ron comes from Decatur and does is he has a backpack, and we have to say that as we grow older, you can't very easily lift and work with a backpack of water and herbicide. So we're in that situation where somebody could come with us if they wanted to, and help lift that sort of weight onto the back of someone to do this sort of thing. And so we have to beg for that sort of interest, that sort of involvement. You can do the same sort of thing with a plastic 1-gallon can, but you'd be forever doing it. So some of those things have to be handed on to another generation that has the muscle power to do it. So Ron has got some arthritis, so we've had to cancel this sort of meet for a while. He's also very interested in prairie, has a little prairie in Iowa, and has developed it to the point where it could be handed over to the Iowa natural area people. And so think about helping with some of these sites and some of the things we have to do. The Native Plant Society sale is on the 7th. It's a Saturday between 1 and 8. And we would encourage you to grow native plants. There's a big push to have milkweeds to support monarchs. But really, that's just one part of the prairie. We need a range of prairie to satisfy a range of interest of up to 2,000 different types of insects, let alone mammals and other things that are there. So we encourage you to grow a prairie. Remember that prairie likes 100% light. And if you have a tree in your backyard and you're going to try and grow a prairie, there's about, what will happen is your perennial plants will become annual plants and then eventually die. You need good open space for prairie plants. There have been, I think last year they ran out of milkweed plants, so I think there'll be plenty of milkweed plants for those that are interested in the butterflies, which seem to be doing better than they were a few years ago. Parkland College is hosting an electronics event on the 21st. So you have to think about this. None of the agencies that normally used to take television sets are taking them anymore. Anything that has tubes in or has a bolt behind a flat television set can be recycled with Goodwill or a number of agencies, but no big old television sets. So this is one of the few times when you can get rid of old television sets, even if they work or don't work. That's okay. The time has passed. And many people have them sitting in their basement because they are still functional televisions. When we went digital, they got to be obsolete. And so it's sad that they're still functional, but they're not fitting into the overall scheme of television and computerization that we're dealing with now. To get to that event, go to Bradley, past Parkland College to Duncan Road, and sneak up on Duncan Road to where there are agricultural sheds and an area where there used to be a homestead, and I suspect that's where the things will be collected. There are certain things I don't want. They don't want refrigerators and stoves and things like that, or other appliances. It's mainly electronics. They don't want coffee grinders or obsolete other pieces of equipment or furniture. No compressed sawdust wood. It's just mainly electronics to try and satisfy the need that is here for getting rid of those items. I don't think they're taking paint and things like that either. So the 21st, and be ready for it. There's a limit of 10 items per family. And make sure that your old pickup truck works, because this is a lineup often which is miles long, and you're there sort of churning over, and you're not getting air through your radiator, and you can boil your car if you're in that sort of situation. We're hoping that there's enough to handle. But I was a little disappointed with some of the previous ones where things like all the paints go into the same bin, and that sometimes paints that are latex can be recycled in a different way than, say, oil paints. These things are buried in places like Kansas, where they're buried with a survey so that people know what is there and how they could be accessed if they leach. Not a simple process. We're going to have a debate probably in the future about Cahokia Mounds. That's in southern Illinois. These were mound building people. They had a metropolis there that was probably bigger than today's London. And they have mounds all the way up the Mississippi, Missouri. We even have mounds in Allerton Park that are an extension of this community. And the attempt is to make it a national monument. It's already on the books for excuse me. Excuse me. It's on the UNESCO books as a international monument. So the attempt is to try and restore, repair, preserve this complex before there's just X number of roads and buildings and development around the periphery. Sometimes the state and federal government provide what is called calamity money to salvage these sorts of places. One of the techniques is, if you have some money to salvage and you don't have a lot of time, and it's being used for agricultural purposes, you take a grader or a bulldozer and you take off the top 10 inches which has been disturbed, and then you have access to the like of post holes for shelters that were there in Cahokia times, and it's referred to as calamity money because you don't have too much time to do this, and so the research that happens is important. Okay, now I want to talk about the National Geographic article, which I think is well worth you reading. It's on Yellowstone and adjacent Grand Tetons National Park. It's sort of Teddy Roosevelt territory. It's the first national park. It's the largest national park. It's the most unique national park. And it's attracting visitors from overseas, and it has size meant to record the acreage, but it's a matter of many, many square miles, and it's enough to cover a lot of ecosystems. That a huge overall ecosystem. The authorities tried over several times to expand that area because there are the likes of large mammals that we can't preserve anywhere else. There's bison, there's elk, there's moose, there's pronghorn antelope, there's cougars, and this is the only place where there's enough room for these creatures to work naturally. Unfortunately, one of the migrations that has to occur is that when winter comes, the animals have to move from high, cold places to lowland places, and some of the lowland is in commercial areas that surround the park rather than in the park itself. And there is a very great growing population of people visiting and also wanting to reside in the area so that they have access to this unique park. It has an underpinning of geology that you need to understand. The hot, molten material under the earth comes to the surface with a lot of steam, and it accumulates to the point where it all of a sudden will burst up through and cause geysers that whoosh thousands of gallons of water and steam into the air for perhaps 150 feet high. And Old Faithful does that fairly regularly. It heats up and then it does it on a regular basis. But there are also lots and lots of pools that are hot and almost boiling, and these pools often are the subject for research because the organisms there are unique, and the biochemists can figure out what's going on and how certain aberrations may become things that they can use. It might be a biochemical that can stay intact at a hot temperature. So there's some fundamental research in this area as well as applied research. Early on, the public wanted to visit these places, so roads were put in. And sometimes that went with fun shows. You could have a Ferris wheel or various almost zoos, and people were given the opportunity to come to a national park like this, and a lot of concessionaires would take advantage and put up facilities where there was a good view. And this was an era when national parks were still sorting themselves out. Since then, it's got to be that the visitors are at lodges or at appointed places, and even the traffic is controlled. If it's in wintertime and you have a road that could be used for snowmobiles, then that's okay to a certain date. Then vehicles can come back to a certain extent. But then when summer comes and there's just thousands of people, they get to be put in buses, and that's a little disturbing for some people who like to have their independence. But this is a way to preserve the dignity of the environment. Actually, the roads take up about 1% of the territory, so there's a lot of wilderness there. So and quite a lot of different habitats. There's a caldera, which means that you have sort of a heat sink underneath mountainous areas which sort of cave in at the edge, and that is interesting. The director, superintendent, is a guy named Wend, and he is very skeptical as to whether we can keep this wilderness garden afloat. No matter how hard they try, and with limited funds, to keep this unique situation free from people invasion, and to maintain the migratory routes, to see that people don't bring in other creatures. Sometimes we have a problem here with an olive tree that was brought in because it had olives that could be used by birds, but the birds are sort of made it a weed tree around the Midwest. Well, guess what? Yellowstone has a lake, and somebody has brought in lake fish that are lake trout that grow to a huge size, and they dominate the lake to the point that the researchers spend a lot of time catching lake trout that shouldn't be there, and supporting the supporting other forms of trout. Often the trout likes a stream that's a sort of little stream running into a lake, and it's very shallow. So then you have to know that the bear can go and get a paw and take out the trout. So there's a balance between the trout and the bears, and there's a balance between elk and buffalo. The hunters like to hunt elk, and that causes a sort of disproportionate concern for the different groups. The poor old moose is a little on the outside. How do you spend your life trying to save grizzly bears that were once down to so few that they were almost extinct? There was a period when all the animals that were likely to invade farmlands were exterminated. So no wolves. Prairie dogs had a hard time. So some of these creatures have been brought back in, and they're doing very well. But they're also not corralled. There's no fence around Yellowstone, so they wander into human areas, and they get exterminated as a result. So how do you work with the adjacent range owners to do this? And the range owners in themselves are interested. If they want to save a toad or something like that, they have to farm in a manner that is different. If they have sheep, for instance, the sheep are invariably a subject for predation, and you have to have dogs, and you have to have your sheep supervised at all time, and that's kind of a pain, but it is also helps to preserve the dignity of the area around Yellowstone. Strangely, there's some creatures that come in that you don't expect. There's a rootworm that comes from the like of Kansas and so on, corn, but it finds its way into the park. And on scree slopes, it's common, and so there are the bears eating these insects. And So the animals themselves are facultative. They can, bears especially, can eat a range of vegetables as well as creatures. How do you provide for that? How do you make sure that there's not an overgrazing? The bison are very fecund and they increase, so how do you control that? Do you have a shootout? And that usually doesn't work very well because there's not enough people to do that. Then you have to corral the animals. You have to see which ones you would cull, so which ones you would send to another zoo, which ones might have brucellosis, which is a disease that hits bovine creatures, and it causes abortion of a fetus. It hasn't happened yet, but there's always the fear amongst farmers that their cattle will get brucellosis from bison. So every so often the bison have to be corralled and checked to see that they don't have the disease. Firing is important. A big fire every 150 years might control the ecosystem and send it in a different direction. So the ecosystem is a dynamic. It's not going to be the same each year. You can't go back to year one and figure that's what's going to happen. It's going to be dynamic, so you have to be prepared for that. Then there are small fires that go perhaps once every 5-10 years, and they can get bigger if you don't have a fire, and there's been Smokey the Bear that sort of prevented a lot of fires. But a nice fire will increase the ecosystem if you allow the native plant litter to accumulate, and you're in a conifer forest. You can very easily have a crown fire, which takes the tree out altogether. So they are a lot of people that are there to act as biologists, looking at all these sorts of things. There are scavengers, and scavengers that include the bears and birds and creatures that have to work with each other. There are horses and mules, so you can go out into the wilderness if you want, but there's a responsibility. You almost have to watch yourself. You have to know what you're doing in places where there are dangerous animals. There's going to be climate change, so that will affect this large natural area. There are native people who have sacred sites, and how do you handle that? Well, this is a huge income, and it's like 900 million came into that park this last year. And the population is increasing by about 10% each year. So how do you convince people to control themselves some? Do we restrict the number of people that come into this park? Early on, the railroads were loving this. They got artists, and every railroad would have pictures of Yellowstone in their carriages, and they would encourage people to come and be. Now it's so well known that you need to have people who perhaps are willing to understand what a beaver will do, how it will dam the water, and how it will change the ecology. And there are even administrative conflicts about what to do with different aspects of things because we just don't know. And the overseas visitation, especially from Asia, has been increasing steadily. And going back to Weld, he's very skeptical that we can keep this rather unique park for the future. It's there. So come back to home base, and how do we even have a small snippet of something like this? So you have a prairie at Manhattan, but it's not the Grand Prairie of East Central Illinois. So we have some ideas about how you might preserve some of this. Some of it is about the Wind Prairie, which is being disconvolvulated at the moment. It's just south of us. But we've been looking at the area between Rantoul and Paxton has an old road, and we would like to use that as a road. We've spoken about this before, but it's the sort of thing where you have to think to the future. I had rail-to-trail people come and I had them get off the 57 at Kankakee. Kankakee has a river that is a glaciated river in its day, and it has sand dunes along the side of it. So you start to try and figure out how the vegetation sorted itself out. And if you come down through Shipance and to Loda, all the area between old Route 45 and the railroad bed is expressive of prairie. And you come through the little towns and you get to Loda, and then Loda has a cemetery reserve area, which is really nice remnant prairie. And Grand Prairie Friends has put a 9-acre buffer zone around it, and it's planted to prairie. So we encourage that sort of thought process. I would like to think of a national park from Kankakee to Rantoul, or perhaps even through to Champaign and further south. It's what do we do with the little pieces we have left is very important. I think we're getting to
3 minutes.
3 minutes. So remind you again that the plant sale, the Grand Prairie Friends plant sale, is at the Lincoln Square on the 7th. Think about putting in a little plot. You can have 10 by 10 of, say, 20 or 30 species and enjoy. It will be a little rambunctious. Prairies aren't rectilinear. They're sort of integrative, and you get used to that ecological balance. You might provide a sandy base for something and have a more Drummer Flanagan soil for something else. If you're in an urban setting, you will invariably have a problem because builders don't like to put buildings on topsoil. So they remove the topsoil, and you're left with a clay soil to work with and a little bit of topsoil stuck on top of it, and that will erode easily, and it's not ideal. So you might have to look at your soil to encourage a little bit of prairie, with the realization that these perennial roots have to go down and find a place to preserve themselves. There's a nice little prairie near to the president's house on Florida, so you can watch some of this sort of thing in action. So I think that's probably what we can do. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WF3 Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And as always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.